Chodesh Tov. Chodesh Tov, and now we're on Daf Lamed Ches. Now we're going to count down to get to where we stopped yesterday. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At the end of the fifth line. So yesterday we spoke about Yesh Aim LeMikra, Yesh Aim LeMesores, and Basil Shita, that we combine the two. We find some sort of a compromise down the middle. And the Gemara concluded that even though there seems to be a contradiction in terms of the tuma of a yoledes and the yemei tara, but the Gemara comes to the conclusion that shiny hasam dechsiv kinidas. So now the Gemara wants to bring another possible makar for this halacha that matana achas is sufficient to generate the kaparas hakarban, and the other three matanos are only lemitzvah. V'tana maisi lebihacha. So we're going to bring a brisa now that has a different source from which we derive the conclusion that one matana is critical. V'kiper v'chiper v'chiper. So we find the pasuk v'chiper repeats itself 3 times. One time regard to the chatos of a melech, one time regard to the chatos of a sa'ir that's brought by a common citizen, and one with regard to a sheep chatos. And this brisa wants to understand why the Torah had to repeat v'chiper 3 times. And we're going to derive from this repetition of a chiper 3 times that only one matana, one application of the dam on one of the 4 chronos is critical. Now, the word v'chiper is being used as, in a certain sense, a mute. But what do I mean by a mute? It's a little bit different than a mute. It means that v'chiper, you already have a kapara to the exclusion of waiting for the next v'chiper, or for the next v'chiper, for the next matana, or the next matana. Now, the brisa continues now to analyze, why do I need this 3-time repetition of v'chiper? What would have been my logical conclusion without the drasha of the 3 v'chipers? I did. In other words, we could have argued that in the case of a korban chatos, all 4 matanos are critical, ali kuva, valodinu, and it would make sense logically to come to that conclusion that all 4 matanos in the case of a chatos are critical. Why would I have come to that conclusion if not for the v'chiper? Because nemru domim lamata v'nemru domim lamala. Right, we said that the mizbeach on the outside has a chut hasikra, a red string that separates the top from the bottom. And certain karbanos, almost all karbanos, require zrika below lamata, below the chut hasikra. There are a few karbanos that are rare and far between, like a chatas behema, that require a nesina on the top part. Just like in the case of the dam application of most karbanos, which is below the chut hasikra, then all we need in those cases, because that doesn't include chatas, is one matana. Is af damim hamurim lemala shenesonim b'matana achas kiper. I would logically, therefore, come to the conclusion that even with regard to a chatos, where the dam has to be applied on the top part of the mizbeach, then one single matana would be enough. So again, at this point, we still don't justify why we need v'chiper, since we could derive that from an equation between the dam lamata and the dam lamala. However, oklach lecha l'derech zu, or should we take a different approach that would lead us to the conclusion that all four matanos are critical, because nemru dome bifnim v'nemru dome bachutz. Now, later on in Maseches Zevachim, we're going to understand why nemru dome bifnim means that those karbanos, and if you remember 2 days ago, we mentioned 5 different karbanos that require applying the dam inside the heichal, and there all the applications are likuva. They're all critical. Our discussion about getting away with one matana as critical and the others are just lemitzvah, that's only bachutz. So therefore, nemru domim bifnim v'nemru dom bachutz, ma domim amurim bifnim chiser achas matanos lo v'lo klum, is af domim amurim bachutz chiser achas matanos lo v'lo klum. Now, according to this logic, it makes sense to compare the karbonos bifnim to the karbonos bachutz, because they're all chatos, they're all made of one, of one entity. And therefore, the Brisa continues and says, Nirla midome, we have now 2 options. We're at a fork in the road. Shall we say, donim chutz mi bachutz, v'ein donim chutz mi bafnim? Maybe we have no right to make any analogies to those unique karbanos whose dam is brought inside the heichal. O klach l'derech zu, donim chatos v'arba kronos mi chatos v'arba kronos. Or is it more logical to say that just like a chatos pnimis requires 4 matanos on the 4 corners of the mizbech hapnimi, so too a chatos chitzona should require 4 matanos on the 4 kronos, and that would be likuva. That would be miyakev. He needs all 4 or bust, just like in the case of a chatos ha-pnimis. But with regard to other karbanos that are brought b'chutz, that's not a valid equation because they don't require 4 kronos. So now we're at a fork in the road. We don't know which way to turn and what analogy would be the appropriate, accurate analogy. Therefore, we need a drasha, in this case, v'chiper, to decide finally and establish that all we need is one matana. Talmud lom v'chiper, and that's going to be it. Now, how do we analyze the trio of v'chiper? V'chiper, the first v'chiper is going to tell me afal pishlo nosan ela shalosh. Correct? We said that the v'chiper is a kind of a mute, and it tells me that reduce 4 by 1 down to 3. Then the second v'chiper is going to reduce it from 3 down to 2. Afal pishlo nosan ela shtayim. V'chiper, the third v'chiper, is going to reduce it to 1. Afal pishlo nosan ela achas. So at this point, we have now successfully suggested a valid alternative to, as right, we don't need the pasuk v'shavach domo, and we can derive it now from the trio of v'chiper. But the Gemara is not happy about it because v'hai mi boile legufe. We could never use a word as a miyut if we need it in its context in pshuto shel mikra, in the straightforward meaning of the text. And the Torah has to tell me in all these 3 cases that the carbon is mechaper. So if that be the case, how do you have a right to use the v'chiper as a drasha when it's needed in order to teach that this variety of chatos affects and creates kapara? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rava bar Ada Mori, my master bar Ada taught me that Omar Krov v'chiper v'nislach. It's not enough, I admit, to derive conclusions and amid from the word v'chiper alone. But there's an extra word here because the Torah says v'chiper v'nislach. Now, what's the difference between v'chiper and v'nislach? In both cases, we're talking about atonement. So why did the Torah have to repeat itself unnecessarily? Zui kapar, zui slicha. So therefore, now we're going to use the v'chiper as a mute because we don't need the v'chiper legufe, as you said, because we already have the word slicha. So the Gemara is still not satisfied. Ema, maybe the reason why we need v'chiper is v'chiper afal pishlo nosan el sholosh lamala v'achas lamata. Maybe the miyut of v'chiper is talking about the case where you need the zrikas adam on the top half of the mizbeach, so that if the avodah is done properly in its maximum way, then all four nesinos would have been on top. But instead, what he did was he missed one nesina lamala, and he made the nesina lamata below the chut hasikra. Now we have a second v'chiper, afal pishlo nosan l'shtayim lamata, shtayim lamala, and then we have a third chiper, afal pishlo nosan lamala lamata. So now it turns out that the three words of a chiper are not describing which, are not addressing which matana is absolutely critical, but rather it's addressing the issue of lamala and lamata, and the three v'chipers tell you that even if you only had one particular nesina lamala, and all other three of the nesinos, the balance of the nesinos were done lamata, nevertheless, v'chiper, the carbon is kosher. So again, what we're saying now in the Gemara's Havamina is that all four nesinos are absolutely critical. You can't get away with less than four. And the triple v'chiper is telling me about afal pishlo nosan lamala el nosan lamata. Omar of Ado bar Yitzchak. Again, we're going to try to defend this drasha of v'chiper against this onslaught that maybe it's only coming to tell you that you could be yotze and mechaper even if the nesina was lamata. In Cain, vitalta Torah's kronos. Now, I'm not sure why is it vitalta Torah's kronos. We only had v'chiper 3 times. That leaves you with 1. Just 1 second. Sometimes I have to bring in the cavalry here. Just 1 second. Me'achar shegam im nosan es kol hamatonos lamata korban kosher. Well, how did he get to that conclusion? Second, hachiper ashlishi bol lavich afal pishno nosan shumatona. Wait, how does he know that if it only says it 3 times? I don't get it. Okay, I'm going to just go over it one more time. Ema v'chiper afal pishno nosan el sholosh lamal. All right, so we subtracted 1. And then the achas lamata, fine. So the fourth, instead of doing it lamali, did it lamata. Okay, that's the first v'chiper. Now v'chiper, a second v'chiper, afal pishlo nosan el shtayim. So he did 2 above and 2 below. Okay, fine. V'chiper. Now we have the third v'chiper. Afal pishlo nosan shumatana. I don't get it. Maybe there's a footnote here. Oh, maybe he asks my question here. Madua midaleges hagemara me'aseder shetchilu lidro. So I said, tzricha lomer, shevachiper ashlishi, bo lelamed, shafal pishlo nosan ela achas lemal. That's our question. V'yesh lomer shagmara soveres, shekeman shem nosan rov ha. Everything depends on rov. So therefore, if you have 3 out of 4 lamata, then it's as if the first one that was lamala was also lamata. Okay, I'm just happy that that my question was raised. That's the advantage of using Masifta. Okay, let's go back. Oh, the Irachmana Omar. So now the Gemara argues, okay, if our drasha is a valid drasha in and of itself, libatlan, maybe the Torah is saying that all the requirements of lamala are only lechatchila, lemitzvah, but enochinami, even if he does 0 nesinos lamala and he does all the nesinos lamata, the Kohen, the carbon is kosher. Omar Rava. Okay, so now Rava has to defend our drasha. Ezu dover shetzarach shalosh hevi omer elu kronos. In other words, it seems like Rav is arguing that it's not a fair derivation or interpretation that the v'chiper is referring to lamala lamata, but rather v'chiper is referring, in the simple, straightforward understanding, to the chronos. And basically, we're talking about where and how many chronos you have to apply the dam. And since we have 3 psukim of a chiper that are superfluous and unnecessary, therefore we're going to use each one of the chipers to reduce the number of chronos by 1, and therefore we reduce it by 3 and we're left with 1. Ema, the Gemara still says, v'chiper afal pishlo nosan ela achas lamala v'sholosh lamata. So I guess the Gemara is now rejecting Rava's logic and saying, no, we can still reject Rava and insist that the V'chiper is telling us about Lamal Lamata, and it's telling us that you can have 3 to subtract from Lamala, do all 3 out of 4 Lamata, even though that's Rov, like we saw before, but nevertheless he has at least one fail-safe, a face-saving Nesina Lamala. And the Gemara says, Lo matzinu damim shechetzin lamala chetzin lamata. So this statement that we're learning now is going to occupy us for a long time here in today's daf. And the Gemara is claiming that in lamala lamata, it's an all or nothing proposition. There's no such thing as having some applications lamala and some lamata. Ain't no such thing. It doesn't exist in the constellation, the world of Kodesh. So the Gemara says below, and therefore we cannot assume that he can get away with 1 nesina lamala, whereas the others are lamata. But Tanan, I'm going to show you that there is such a thing as splitting the nesinos between lamala lamata from the avodas Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim. And this is a Mishnah, I believe, in Masechta Yoma on Daf Nun Gimel. He's a mimenu achas lamala v'sheva lamata. Right, this we're familiar from the Musaf service of Yom Kippur, that the dam from the combination of the par v'sor of Yom Kippurim, where the dam was mixed up, and then he goes into the heichal. And he does 1 azah lamala and sheva lamata. Again, we're not talking about the chut hasikra over here. We're talking about the kaporis, right? The covering over the aron. But nevertheless, the Gemara is making that analogy that if the Kohen Gadol sprinkled the blood once upwards and 7 downwards, v'hiza b'yatzbo al pnei kaporis kedma v'lefnei kaporis yazeh sheva pa'omim, So the the pasuk says Kedma. I guess Kedma, the Gemara understands to mean upwards on the upper half of the kapores, and then it says L'fnei kapores, which is referring to the downward motion of the lower half of the kapora. So we see that part of the dam goes above and part below, and the Gemara is making an analogy to the two parts of the mizbeach as far as Rikas Adam is concerned. And the Gemara says kimatzlif. So what does that mean, kimatzlif? My kimatzlif, kimenagdo dona. So I think what the Gemara is saying is that the way that the Kohen Gadol did the Hazoya on Yom Kippur on the Kapores is through the back of his hand, kimatzlif. And if it's kimatzlif, then the dam eventually will drip down, and it will be on both the top half of the kaporos and the bottom half of the kaporos. Let's just see what he says over here. He has a langa arichus here. So again, he says here that the sprinklings were not aimed to land on different parts of the kaporos, but rather sprinkling towards the kaporos, towards the top, towards the bottom. The first sprinkling was aimed at the most distant from the Kohen Gadol. Successive ones were aimed progressively closer. He got closer and closer to the kapores. Thus, the Kohen Gadol sprinkled like one who administers lashes and wishes and whips the victim from the shoulders downward, striking progressively. So the only difference between the upward and the downward sprinkling was in the position of the Kohen Gadol's hand. Let's go on. Now the Gemara says, Hiza al tahoro shel mizbeach sheva pa'amim. Okay, this is a Mishnah in Masechta Yoma. And we're going to again try to prove that there is a sprinkling of the dam that's both lemala and lemata. Again, we have to figure out what tahoro shel mizbeach means. How do you translate those words?